Good morning. I want to just express what a privilege and honor and a pleasure it's been to be able to speak to many of the folks who are in this room over the course of the last almost 20 years as we've been working on community, maybe family, and participating as a member of the descendant community, and in my capacity as an anthropologist, which is what I'm doing today. So in some ways, my presentation will overlap with some things that I've talked about before, having to do with New York's African burial ground and the way that project proceeded with its the first engagement with descendant communities in archaeology, like period. But I will try to move beyond that quickly, offer some new examples of what the science can do, and focus more on memorialization at that site, and then some other sites that have developed more recently and that that have some relationship to the African burial ground, sometimes inspired by it. So the this is the beginning of the excavation, the archaeological excavation of the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan in 1991. It was rediscovered as the earliest and largest cemetery of non-indigenous people in North America. It's certainly also the largest and earliest African cemetery in North America. I have to be cautious about earliest and largest. This always changes. But, it's something like that. It was important in many ways. And by law, sites in the way of, in this case, a federal building project must be addressed archaeologically. Now, one might assess that it's there, as they did in 1989, and have vetting with the community, as the Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires, and ultimately decide that that site needs to be retained as a cemetery. But as often takes place in the economic and racial environment, and this is the 1990s, not much different from today, the US GSA, the General Services Administration's interest was in building its building as quickly as possible, and so that vetting was not adequate. And archaeology proceeded to remove the remains to allow the building project. And by the time I showed up on the site, invited by agencies and public committees. Committees had formed under Mayor Dinkins, under State Senator, later to be a lieutenant, later to be a Governor Patterson. Public committees formed, concerned, increasingly angry about the excavation of the site in the early 90s, brought me on. Nearly all of the 419 skeletal remains had been excavated and moved. And so a struggle ensued between the public generally, led by African Americans and other African diasporic people, joined by those of common empathy, to protest the destruction of a sacred site. What I brought on board was a team of anthropologists, historians, and other cognate disciplines who were comfortable with the idea of being activist scholars. We interceded on behalf of the community. I would say, inspired partly by a long history of African diasporic, African scholarship, activist scholarship, understanding that what we do plays a role in discerning information about the past, plays a role in the politic in which we operate today, as people like Carter G. Woodson understood, creating, those institutions, the first institutions of African American historiography and Black History Week. This was a political act. Du Bois talks about it as well. And that the hidden history, the hiding of history, is also a political act, and the objectification of the other, a political act. But this kind of objectification of the other also extended to Native people. And those anthropologists who joined me some of us were rising from the throes of indigenous peoples' protests around the world, especially Native Americans, for the appropriation of their skeletal remains, sacred sites, the 18,000 Native American remains at the Smithsonian. There were 27 Euro-Americans available for study when I was there, 18,000 Native Americans. Those numbers mean something. It's about the objectification of the other. And there's been some interesting discussion here about hominid past. So I had many colleagues, most colleagues, who would have said in 1991, who did, some still say, that the business of reburying the dead or protecting cemeteries is about religion, and it is religion standing against science. And they have the objective means of science for all of humankind. I have a colleague at the Smithsonian who says it just that way. But I think any anthropologist should understand that the burial of the dead, funerary practice, is a human characteristic. It is the first archaeologically discoverable act of symbolic communication, which describes humans. We share food, we walk on two legs, we use fire and make it, and when we get to the origin of our species in this legacy we've been hearing a little bit about from South Africa through Kenya and Ethiopia, when we get to our species, they bury their dead, and no other animal does that. So this is about a challenge of the humanity of the people. Yes, it has to do with all kinds of religion, every religion and none. I'm agnostic. I hope that I will be decently buried because I'm a human being. And so now, but we're also, let's say, Homo sapiens. Maybe we can be wise. We're certainly inquisitive. And so my folks sought to bring to this situation a combination of a way of synthesizing. Let's call it Homo sapiens and Homo reminiscens, I like to call us. The memorial maker. They're all over the place. You know we've been there by the little stones and the big ones. And so there is, so we say, well, we'll only work with the permission of the community because they, as an ethical client, we can hurt them by working with these remains. And what the IRBs do, institutional review boards involving human subjects, they require informed consent. So we engaged in meetings like this, talked about our ideas, community, this is the descendant community, but they are empowered as an ethical client. We are obligated to them because of our professional ethics to do no harm, and finding out their questions for our research. If they will let us, they have this is a clientage model because we don't work with them. Ours was not these many models that have come up today in which there are many different stakeholders, and there may be cases in which that's important, particularly for a cemetery and perhaps beyond. This is about the plural democratization of knowledge. in which everyone is not the same, in which I've been kind of thinking of Lonnie Guinier's tyranny of the majority. It is the family that buries its dead. It's the descendants that are the stewards of the dead. The neighbors should come. Hopefully the congregations will join. But who determines the disposition of the dead is not everyone in that kind of, there's a plural democracy embodied in this ethic. And so these were African Americans and other diasporic people. We have professional obligation. We're doing science and scholarship. The evidence isn't there. We're not going to say it. And then we have a business client who we're also responsible to. So we drew from the National Historic Preservation Act the language in Section 106 that we entered into archaeological parlance, the term descendant community, for this clientage in which that community is empowered to say yes or no. In the end, they said yes to a project that they helped construct. Just a quick two quick examples. So just last week at the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, we presented new results, brand new results. This is the back of the femur or thigh bone, and you see the exaggerated linea aspera. It's a muscle attachment. I could show you another slide, but I'm moving quickly here, in which you basically can't see this thing. You see a little ridging, maybe a little roughness, that's it. So we had several grades of muscle attachment enlargement, and these muscle attachments are enlarged as a result of work. So the bones are alive in the living person, and the muscle attachment enlarges according to the arduousness of the work. So the larger the muscle attachment, the more that person worked, the harder they worked during their lives. So we have a more extensive array, but I can show you this. So these are changes in time. Turn of this, maybe about 1700, late 1600s. At the late period is the War of Independence. And these are a little problematic, but these are the middle periods. Increased frequency in men's workload, increased frequency in women's workloads. We know that increasingly the colony is becoming disproportionately populated by women and children, especially after those periods of rebellion that were marked by high proportions of men. Some would argue that with these changes, that it was also becoming, New York more urban, where these different urban domestic occupations, that's part of the mix. Some might argue that, therefore, it was more benign slavery over time, but a muscle attachment is a muscle attachment. And women's work even exceeds that of males by virtue of this. So that comes one of our lines of evidence in a conversation with historians. I want to here's an example of that conversation as it occurred at one point about 10 years ago. Historian Eric Siemens, it almost really seemed like a setup. The New York Times had an announcement that our heart-shaped symbol could not be Sankofa, and I'm going to put it Sankofa, which is an Akan symbol, and a Dinkra symbol that means, look to the past to inform the present and the future. And we thought we might have it in this individual's coffin lid. There are other possibilities we were careful to mention. Siemens, in essence, is, as a certain kind of white historian, I'll say, says it cannot be the Sankofa because no white person recorded it at that time. In other words, it doesn't appear in history if it doesn't appear in writing. And really, he said, the three Adinkra symbols that were presented to the British when they made their incursions into Ashanti-land don't have Sankofa on them, so this cannot be Sankofa. There are lots of other kinds of arguments one can use, and the basic one is that We had other methods. This is a person who, based on his dental filing, was probably born in the Americas, but clearly has African memory in that he's filed his teeth. He's in a community that we know has Coromontes. These are Akan-speaking people. So the possibility is there. And so, so an idiot might say, well, scientifically, we have the material, so it is Sankofa. Well, we don't. We know we have plausibility here. But he says, and his effort is really to say that we should understand that African Americans are Creole, and that is a kind of argument of sloughing off the roots to Africa, that we are fabricating roots to African roots. So, like we don't understand Creolization. Interestingly enough, recently, a student and I worked on this. We went back to the 1825 Adinkra, and there it is. There it is, if you want it. I'm saying you don't need it. But he reported that he looked at this Adinkra cloth and did not see it. Someone else earlier today was talking about not seeing things or seeing things that based on. Very quickly, the visitor center was created. Here we see that symbol became important. On the National Monument, which was initially planned, the GSA said, well, we'll give you a plaque on the wall. Whatever, 10 years of struggle later or less, it became a national monument because people, community believed in that. Rodney Leon's design. I do want to say I enjoy this is in the floor. Child between 1 and 2 years. Well, there were maybe 40% of the 419 who would have had one or different ages described as a child. That required the science. The individual, knowing something about the individual involved our work. And so the science is, what is memorialization? It's partly about memory, restoring people to memory. There are ways in which the science is desecrating or not. And I think a lot has to do with who makes the decision. The return of the remains. Again, one of the boxes has this symbol. Many people. I'll just finish by saying there's a discussion of the African burial ground in which Ruby Dee is involved, and she says something like, she wonders what these enslaved people thought as they suffered. She says, well, what did they hope for? What did they hope for? I think that's us. Let's be that thing. Thank you.